Slippery green down. Josh and Mika in a house. Turn the lights down low. Here we go. It's Wednesday night and the frights come alive. We're dropping screams with the jokes on the side. Monsters, killers, ghosts in the dark, but we're laughing while we're watching, that's a trademark. Wednesday night frights, we set the vibe. Josh and Mika keep the horror alive. Chills and thrills with the beat so tight. Every week we bring the shadows to light. So grab your popcorn, lock the doors. It's Wednesday night frights, let's explore.
Hey everyone, welcome back, all you night dwellers. You have tuned into Wednesday Night Frights, where we crack open the coffin lid of what's happening in Hollywood right now. I'm Josh, your host. Tonight we are Mika-less. She has been super busy, so you get to hang out with just me tonight. But that's all right. We're going to keep the lights dim, the popcorn salty, and the conversation deadly serious about horror, of course. Now, tonight's lineup is going to be The Conjuring. Last Rites has officially claimed the crown as, so far, 2025's highest grossing horror film. But what makes it work when so many others flatline? Netflix has dropped a massive October horror lineup, from true crime, ghosts, monsters, and a few cult favorites. So we'll talk about whether streaming is helping horror evolve or just recycling our nightmares. There's a brand new Resident Evil reboot on the horizon with new faces, new tone, and a surprisingly dark comedy twist. And I wonder, can this franchise really rise again from the ashes? Uh, then we have a haunted attraction industry is going high tech, those local haunted houses with AI driven jump scares and motion sensing monsters. Are we getting closer to horror that actually knows how to scare you? We'll also touch on House on Eden, a new found footage horror flick that's blurring the line between influencer culture and terror, and talk about the rising wave of legacy horror sequels that are clawing their way back to life. So grab your flashlight, lock the doors, and get comfortable, because the only thing more terrifying than the dark is what's happening in horror right now. So first off, thank you so much there, Big Meanie. I'm loving the theme song too. It kind of takes me back to my younger days, and a little more grungy, a little bit more pop metal-ish, and it's just a lot of fun. It fits my vibe, and Mika seems to enjoy it. But so first up tonight is I want to talk about Conjuring Last Rites. The film has officially become the highest grossing horror movie of 2025, pulling in a little over $400 million worldwide. So right now, it's the king of this year's box office scares, dethroning some heavy hitters along the way. You have Sinners, Final Destination Bloodlines, and even Weapons, which had a pretty viral run earlier this summer. And what's even crazier is how it started. Last Rites opened right at about $194 million global debut, making it the biggest opening weekend in horror history. That's not just big for the genre. I mean, that's blockbuster level money. It rivaled the kind of numbers Marvel used to pull before superhero fatigue really started to set in. But for me, the kicker though is that critics are divided. The film is sitting, last I checked, right around that 59% on Rotten Tomatoes, which, let's be honest, that's a coin toss kind of movie. Normally, that kind of middling score might slow down a film's momentum, but not here. Audiences don't seem to care at all. The seats were full, the buzz was loud, and fans are keeping the train running. But why? And I think it's because this franchise has something special. There's, of course, Patrick Wilson, Vera Farmiga, both returning as Ed and Lorraine Warren, the ghost hunting duo that is the heart of the greater cinematic universe, and has been for over a decade now. And Last Rites is being billed as that final chapter in their story. There is a real sense of closure. not just for the characters, but for fans who have been on this ride since 2013's The Conjuring. So there's emotion baked into this one. You can feel it, that bittersweet energy saying goodbye to a familiar world. Um, but whether it's really the end or just another finale that opens the door to more spin-offs is another story. But I think what's fascinating about The Conjuring Last Rites is how it's outperforming movies that should, on paper, have equal or better drawing power. So the top five horror movies this year, obviously, you have Conjuring Last Rites there at number one. But number two, um, ooh, you have Sinners, and Sinners worldwide gross of $367 million. It's captivating audiences, and then you have the legacy sequel, Final Destination: Bloodlines, right around 315 million. Weapons got up to 266, and then it's a pretty big jump. You have 28 years later that pulled in right around 151 million, but that's still pretty big for horror in a world coming back from COVID, where it seems that the theaters are kind of dead by and large. But you have Sinners, the completely original horror film. It had this incredible domestic run, crossing $258 million domestically. Conjuring is only around 150, 155 million domestically. So Sinners is much better performing here in the US, but The Conjuring seems to have this larger global reach. And so I think one of the biggest takeaways this year is that international audiences are really carrying not just horror, but film in general. About $250 million of Last Rites total haul came from overseas, particularly Europe and Asia. And that tells us that horror might be one of the few genres that's still thriving in the world. And I think that brings up an interesting question. Are we seeing a shift where brand recognition and global appeal now outweigh critical reception? Because honestly, this movie is proof that franchise trust is stronger than Rotten Tomatoes scores. I mean, if you think about it, the Conjuring universe, having been around for about 12 years, it's survived every trend: found footage, elevated horror, slashers, pandemic thrillers, and it has spawned its own universe of 8 films: Conjuring 2, Conjuring the Devil Made Me Do It, 3 Annabelle spinoffs, The Nun 2, and now The Last Rites. So, I mean, that's more films than most horror universes ever really dream of sustaining. And the tone, the mix of the gothic atmosphere, religious horror, and the emotionally grounded storytelling, I think has been remarkably consistent. But what makes The Conjuring so enduring when other horror franchises fade out after a sequel or two? And I think it is the human element of these films, because the Warrens they're not monsters, they're not slasher villains, they're just people. They're human. They represent faith, love, and this idea that good can stand against pure evil. And audiences, even in a world full of cynicism, still respond to that dynamic. I think each movie reminds us that horror isn't just about jump scares, it's also about an emotional connection to the characters that are trying to survive in the darkness. And with Last Rites closing that main arc, I think we have to ask, is this the real ending or just a pause before the next expansion? I mean, let's face it, this universe prints money. The Nun was previously the top grossing entry, making around 366 million globally, but Last Rites has now passed that by a comfortable margin. Generally speaking, studios do not walk away from numbers like that. Um, Maybe this is less of a goodbye and more of a transition. Maybe they're going to move on to new investigators, new cases, or another era, maybe going back in time to supernatural storytelling. Who knows? But with that kind of money, it's hard to just stop. I think another key angle here is what kind of horror are people gravitating towards now? Supernatural horror seems to be kind of reclaiming its throne in a year where we've had everything from grounded social thrillers like Sinners to meta horror with weapons. It's fascinating that the biggest success still comes from good old fashioned haunted houses and demonic possessions. And I wonder if that could be because audiences are craving something that feels spiritual again, or maybe just something bigger than reality. Slashers, creature features, gore fest, they all come and go, but ghost stories and the kind that suggests that there is something beyond what we can explain, I think those really stick with us. And The Conjuring taps into that primal fear really kind of perfectly. And let's also not forget timing. Last Rites hit theaters just as spooky season marketing began ramping up, and it positioned itself as both a blockbuster and an event film. The supposed final curtain call for Ed and Lorraine, the end of an era kind of energy that drives ticket sales. People want to witness conclusions, even if we might be a little skeptical. And that kind of emotional framing really works. The movie's promotional campaign leaned very heavily on nostalgia, family legacy, faith. This wasn't just another horror sequel, it was presented as this kind of farewell to these characters. And that paired with the Conjuring name was the perfect storm. But real quick, before we move on, I want to step back and take a look at the bigger picture. What does all of this tell us about horror in 2025? So you have Sinners, an original horror success story showing that there's absolutely room for fresh ideas. Final Destination Bloodlines, a legacy revival bringing back a franchise that had been dormant for years. The Conjuring, the supernatural juggernaut built on more than a decade of audience trust, and Weapons, using a viral marketing phenomenon that turned intrigue and mystery into a drive to box office fuel. Together, I think these films represent a snapshot of modern horror. These are original stories that can break out. Nostalgia and brand loyalty still dominate, and viral buzz is now just as important as positive reviews. So, if you're a horror fan, this could be the start of a golden age when horror isn't just the cheap thrill genre anymore. It's one of the most reliable box office performers worldwide. So here's what I want to throw back to you. Why do you think the Conjuring universe still works when so many of these horror franchises seem to just kind of fizzle out? Do you think it's the atmosphere, the old school ghost story structure? Is it the Warrens as characters, which ground the horror in faith and love instead of nihilism? Or is it that people just want a well crafted scare that's rooted in something spiritual and eternal? Or maybe most importantly, does Conjuring Last Rites earn its crown because it's a really good film or simply because it's the last one? Is this a perfect ending or the franchise equivalent of one last jump scare? I mean, with numbers like these, I definitely would not be surprised if we're sitting here next year talking about the Conjuring Resurrection. So we'll see where that ends up. Next up, if you've been scrolling Netflix the so far this month, the first week of October, You've probably noticed it feels like Halloween kind of vomited across your home screen. The streaming giant has unleashed one of its most ambitious horror lineups we've seen in years. Oh, real quick. Is it because the ghost haunting structure, it's sort of primal or basic fears for us? And I no, you're totally right. I think that's what it is, that it speaks to something primal, that what creeps in the darkness, what is just outside of the physical world and our vision. Absolutely. Yeah. That ghost haunting structure is so effective, far more effective and lasting than gore on the screen. I agree completely. But now back to Netflix, though, it seems this year that they have one of their most ambitious lineups of horror yet. And it's not just throwing these random scares at us, there's a clear strategy coming from Netflix. This year, their October horror slate reads like almost like a greatest hits mix. It's a blend of classics, cult favorites, and a few new surprises that all but guarantee no one's horror tastes go unserved. We've got Cobwebs from 23, a sleeper hit that kind of got overlooked in theaters but found audiences later. The Elixir, which is one of this year's creepiest original releases. We have The Strangers from 2008, which is one of the most unnerving of the home invasion films. 1979's Dracula, and the all-time essential Night of the Living Dead from 1968. And then for those of you that prefer your chills to come from real life, they've also added My Father, the BTK killer, tapping into the sort of true crime side of fear. I mean, it's a pretty wild spread. You've got supernatural horror, monster flicks, psychological dread, and real world terror all bundled up into their monthly lineup. Netflix isn't just programming for horror fans, they're programming for every type of horror fan. It's sort of an all you can eat buffet of nightmares, a little something for everyone, no matter how you like your scares served up. But that brings us up to a bigger question. Is this helping the genre thrive, or is Netflix's horror strategy spreading the fear maybe too thin? So, starting with the good, on the one hand, the sheer accessibility of horror right now is incredible. If you grew up like me in the 80s and 90s, hunting for VHS tapes in the dusty video store aisles, this era kind of feels like a dream come true. There's no more waiting for the midnight TV rerun of The Thing or Halloween. You can get an entire horror marathon spanning decades at the click of a button. And Netflix, they fully know this. They've leaned hard into the quote unquote spooky season model, trying to turn October into a full blown event. Every October, the data spikes. Horror viewership, they say on Netflix, jumps by as much as 35% compared to other months. That's not just a minor blip, that's a pretty big surge. And when you think about it, that really makes sense. Horror has become part of the fall ritual. It's pumpkin spice, flannel shirts, and fear, all kind of bundled together. But the flood of content also, I think it shows something deeper about how we consume horror today. When you open up Netflix, you're not exactly curating your own experience, right? The algorithm is determining what to show you. It decides what you will see first. What shows up on your homepage isn't random, it's what Netflix wants you to click. And when Netflix pushes certain titles, maybe a true crime doc over a slow burn ghost story, that shapes what the masses think horror looks like. And that's when the big question becomes how much of our horror diet is actually being chosen by us and how much is being fed to us. Think about how easy it is to hit play on something that pops up with that big red number one in movies today banner. That tag alone can make this mediocre film go viral overnight. I mean, It's not horror, but look what it did with Ice Cube, um, War of the Worlds. Not a good movie, actually, a pretty terrible movie, but it got huge viewership because it was plastered on the front page of Prime. But for horror, that's a blessing and a curse. Small indie films that might have been ignored in theaters can suddenly explode on a streaming platform, like His House or The Ritual did in the past. But on the flip side, it can also bury some of the more experimental, weirder horror projects that don't fit in the algorithm's patterns. And Netflix system rewards engagement. If people click it, it rises, and if they don't, it just sinks. Which means that what gets promoted is often the kind of horror that's the easiest to digest. It's short, it's punchy, uh, familiar, right? In a way that creates a new kind of studio system. But instead of producers and executives deciding what gets made, it's this invisible hand of data analytics. And speaking of familiar, let's talk about nostalgia horror because it is everywhere right now. We're in a moment where, as an audience, we're craving comfort horror, something familiar, something that's safe, even that's designed to scare us. And I think Netflix knows that. By stacking their lineup with films like The Strangers, like Night of the Living Dead, they're tapping into that collective memory. We know those stories, we've seen them, maybe with a blanket pulled up to our chins, maybe on a grainy TV at a sleepover, but there's comfort in revisiting old fears. So I guess the question is, why is that happening? And I think it's part of that is cultural. After a few chaotic years, pandemic anxiety, global uncertainty, seemingly nonstop bad news, revisiting older horror feels almost stable. There's this weird safety in it. We know what's coming, we know where the scares land, and it's a fear that we have complete control of. And that doesn't mean horror fans don't want new material, because we absolutely do, right? We seek out something new and something scary, something that's never been done before. But we're starting to see a balance forming between comfort and curiosity, because we'll binge something like The Fall of the House of Usher, The Haunting of Hill House, because it's polished, serialized, and very easy to stay with. But we'll also revisit Dracula from 1979 because it scratches that sort of gothic itch in a way modern horror, apart from like the new Nosferatu, but the way it rarely does. It becomes some kind of this cinematic comfort food. But here's where I think Netflix gets pretty smart, because they're not just dropping horror content, they're strategically layering it. They'll throw out a legacy title like Night of the Living Dead right next to something like The Elixir, a new film with the potential to become this breakout hit, and then see what happens. Well, someone who came for the classic might stick around for the new one. It's kind of brand piggybacking. It's nostalgia as a marketing tool. You might not know The Elixir, but when it's sitting one row over or right next to Romero's classic, you might give it a shot. And I think that's how Netflix wins. It creates an environment where the old lifts the new and the new recontextualizes the old, kind of a horror synergy. But it's not just Netflix doing this. Other platforms like Shudder, Hulu's Huluween collections do it as well, just on smaller, more niche scales. I think what's making Netflix's approach different is its sheer reach. Netflix has something like 250 million global subscribers, meaning when they drop a horror heavy lineup, the ripple effect is enormous. Films that might have had niche audiences suddenly go global overnight. Take Cobwebs that I mentioned before, for example. When it was released in 2023, it kind of flew under the radar, had a very small theatrical window, a quiet marketing push, and yet it had the DNA of a cult classic. Eerie suburban isolation, childhood paranoia, a fantastic central performance by Lizzie Kaplan. Fast forward to Netflix adding it to their lineup this October, and suddenly Cobweb is trending again. Number 6 worldwide for horror. And I think that's the Netflix effect. Then you've got The Elixir, which is one of this year's standout originals. It's a film that blends sci fi and supernatural in a way that echoes Flatliners and Event Horizon. The reviews have been solid. It's benefited from massively from being front and center in the horror row. It's being talked about not just by horror fans, but mainstream audiences in general who otherwise might not have sought it out. Netflix is turning discovery into destiny. Still, there's this danger of oversaturation. When you throw everything at us at once, you risk numbing us. Horror loses some, if not a lot, of its impact when there is no contrast. When everything is scary, then nothing is scary. And think about it. If you eat dessert all day, at some point, even chocolate cake stops tasting sweet. The same goes for horror. When the feed is endless fear, some of that potency gets diluted. The shock fades, the dread dulls. And that's where curation comes in. It's something Netflix is both good and bad at because they offer massive selection. So that's good, but bad because the presentation can feel pretty chaotic. There's no sense of seasonal pacing or storytelling structure, just a flood. Compare that to how something like a Shutter builds more thematic playlists, haunted houses, folk horror, 70s grindhouse, things like that. That's guided horror. Netflix, I think, could learn from that. Right now, it's less a haunted house and more a haunted warehouse. Still, as a horror fan, I can't be too mad because this lineup does give us an excuse to re-engage with the classics while we're finding some maybe new favorites along the way. And that's kind of the sweet spot for a modern horror season, that ability to blend comfort with curiosity, because most of us have that annual rewatch that we do of certain movies and then just throw in a couple of new ones. And then I think another thing worth noting is the true crime crossover. My Father, the BTK Killer, might not be a traditional horror film, but Netflix placing it alongside the genre blurs the line between fictional terror and factual horror. And I think that's pretty brilliant. True crime scratches the same itch for many viewers, the morbid curiosity, the darkness, the unknown. But when it's grounded in reality, Netflix is saying, hey, fear isn't just supernatural. Sometimes it's just the guy next door. I think that adds a very psychological layer to their horror offerings, and it keeps the lineup pretty fresh. So to pull back for a second, what we're seeing this October is less about quantity and more about identity. Netflix is positioning itself not just as a streaming service, but as the home of horror during the spooky season. It's marketing, sure, but it's also cultural curation. The fact that we're sitting here and discussing what's on Netflix like it's an annual horror film festival means that they've kind of succeeded. And I personally really like the mix. I love being able to jump from Night of the Living Dead straight into Elixir or from Dracula to a new docu-series about real life killers. That kind of range makes horror feel alive and evolving, not just stuck in one decade or one subgenre. But at the same time, it makes me wonder what comes next. Will streaming platforms start curating interactive horror experiences, choose your own nightmare style? Will they integrate augmented reality or live tie ins like a virtual haunted house? Um, Horror has always been an adaptive genre, and streaming is its latest evolution. The home screen is the new marquee. So maybe the real question isn't whether Netflix is spreading horror too thin. Maybe it's how far they can stretch it before it stops being horror at all. Either way, one thing's for sure, October belongs to Netflix right now. And as long as they keep mixing old school terror with modern experimentation, I'll keep pressing play, even if sometimes I want to look through my fingers. And not to mention, in November, they have Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein dropping. So there's that as well. And then next is the undead elephant in the room, because apparently, no matter how many times they've tried to kill it, it just won't stay dead. Resident Evil is getting another reboot for 2026. Another one. Now, I enjoy Resident Evil. I grew up around the games, um, watching the old CG cutscenes that they somehow were more scary than the movies at the time. But this reboot sounds, well, it sounds pretty interesting because apparently they're ditching everything we know. No Jill Valentine, no Leon Kennedy or Chris Redfield, no Claire or Ada. None of the legacy icons that have defined the franchise. Instead, this is going to be a completely new story that mixes dark comedy with horror. Early reports describe it as Severance meets True Detective. And that sounds cool on paper, right? Corporate dread meets existential horror, but it also makes me nervous because Resident Evil isn't just any horror franchise. It's one of the few with a mythology that fans really care about. And taking that mythology and tossing it in the biohazard bin feels like a very risky move. It's like trying to make Scream, but without Sidney Prescott. Sure, you can technically do that. And we've seen it happen, but you better bring something new to the table, something so fresh, so confident that it earns the right to stand in the same room. Because fans don't just love Resident Evil for the monsters, they love the faces that face the monsters. Jill's quiet resilience, Leon's cool headed charm, Claire's compassionate, even Wesker, the walking embodiment of what if sunglasses were a personality. These characters are the spine of the story, and now we're cutting into the spine to see if the corpse can walk without it. And the part that really gets me is calling it a dark comedy. Now, Resident Evil has always flirted with this campiness. There's always been a little self awareness there, the kind of melodrama that turns into unintentional humor, but making it intentionally funny, that seems like pretty new territory. It's a bold swing, I'll give them that, but bold doesn't always mean good because there's a tonal balancing act, and horror comedy to me is one of the hardest genres to get right. The humor can't undercut the horror can't drown out the horror. You need both to feed each other, like Shaun of the Dead, where you laugh until suddenly you don't. So the question becomes, can Resident Evil pull that off? So let's pull zoom out just for a second. The franchise has been through more reboots than my Windows update, but you've got the Paul W.S. Anderson films, these action horror chaos that really catapulted Mila Jovovich into this apocalyptic superhero. Fun, sure. Faithful, no, not at all. Then Welcome to Raccoon City a couple years back in 21 tried to go back to the roots, familiar characters, the mansion, the police station, but it was crammed so tight with fan service that the horror never had room to breathe. Then came the Netflix series in 22, which decided to do its own thing entirely. half family drama, half corporate conspiracy. And it wasn't awful, but it wasn't Resident Evil. It just didn't have the DNA. So here we are again. The series reanimating itself for another bite, but this time trying to have a sense of humor about it. And honestly, maybe it is the smart move because Resident Evil, like we said, has always been a little bit ridiculous. A serious story about zombies caused by corporate greed, wrapped in this B movie dialogue and impossible, unbelievable science. Maybe embracing that absurdity, leaning into the fact that humanity keeps creating its own monsters is exactly what it needs. But I think they need to be careful because if they go too far into the comedy, they risk defanging the fear. And the Resident Evil world has always been about isolation, paranoia, that creepy feeling that you're just one bad decision away from turning into the thing you're running from. So if the jokes start flying faster than the tension can build, it's going to start to feel pretty hollow. And right now, we have hit a pretty amazing space of video game adaptations right now. The Last of Us has really set a new bar, faithful to the source, but cinematic and emotionally rich. Fallout really surprised everyone by being darkly funny and genuinely human. And Arcane proved that animation can make a video game world feel alive in ways that live action never could. We've come a long way from the days of Dungeons, Double Dragon, and Super Mario Brothers in the early 90s. So maybe this new Resident Evil will learn from its peers. It could be the show that finally stops trying to be the game and instead explores what the games are all about. And I think that's the difference because the best adaptations don't try to recreate, they just try to translate. So here's how I do it. Not that anybody's asking, but if anyone from Capcom or Sony Pictures is listening, keep the horror grounded. Don't go global apocalypse. Keep it small, contained. One facility, one outbreak. Follow ordinary people, scientists, janitors, security guards, who start realizing they're part of something monstrous. Make us in the audience feel that claustrophobia, that creeping sense of dread. Then use the dark humor to highlight just how absurd it all is. The memos, the corporate slogans, the PowerPoints about ethical mutation practices. Because Resident Evil has always been about one thing, really human arrogance. People thinking that they can control what cannot be controlled. Play that straight, and I think the comedy will write itself. And we have to remember that this whole reboot fatigue is real and it's going to happen. So it comes down to, do we really need another Resident Evil project? Probably not. But maybe we deserve one that finally gets it right because the core of Resident Evil, underneath the guns, underneath the gore, it's a deeply human story about the fear of contamination, the fear of losing yourself, and the fear of what happens when we start playing God. Those are timeless. And right now, I think they hit harder than ever. Post pandemic, this story could be a mirror, a corporate horror story that feels too close for comfort. A world where profit is worth more than people, where the virus isn't just a plot device, it's a metaphor for greed, denial, decay. If they can tap into that, I think it'll be a very entertaining, and I'll be one of the first in line to watch it. So, I mean, maybe it'll be worth catching, but we'll see when it happens. Now, just for a minute, I want to step away from the screen for a second because horror, as we all know, it's not just something we watch anymore. It's something that we live. It's no longer confined to the flicker of a TV or the echo of your surround system. Step into the right haunted attraction today, and it's like stepping into a horror movie that's watching you. Uh, One of the most exciting and slightly terrifying elements or developments in the haunted house industry is the integration now of artificial intelligence. I just found out about this place called Bennett's Curse. They're pioneering what might be called the smart scare. We're talking about attractions that use AI driven scare systems that adapt to each visitor in real time. These systems, they combine everything from motion sensors to scent effects, from ambient soundscapes to adaptive lighting, all being coordinated through these sophisticated algorithms. So picture this: you're walking down this narrow hallway in near darkness. There's a subtle hissing in a corner, maybe a shadow or something slightly darker than the darkness darts past the wall. If you freeze, the AI notices. If you flinch or step back, the scare triggers in a slightly different way than it would for someone moving confidently forward. Some systems even monitor where your gaze lingers, detecting if you're avoiding eye contact with certain props or actors. In short, these haunted houses are learning your behavior and adjusting the experience accordingly. Now, think about that for a second, because in a traditional haunted attraction, scares are generally choreographed or pre programmed, and they're completely based on timing. You hit a trigger, a skeleton pops out, scare's over. But when you start adding AI into that mix, that predictability then vanishes. The scares can shift dynamically. You might hear whispers in one hallway, footsteps in another. You might smell smoke and decay just when you least expect it. And all of it could be tailored specifically to how you're reacting. In essence, the haunted house is no longer static, it's sentient, or at least it feels sentient. That's kind of a next level bit of terror, because horror works best when it surprises you. It thrives on unpredictability, and AI can generate unpredictability in ways and at speeds that humans simply can't. A human actor can only perform so many actions before they become repetitive or predictable, but a system running a real time algorithm, well, it can craft infinitely varied sequences of scares, each one subtly different, designed to keep your adrenaline constantly on edge. But, and here's where the conversation I think gets interesting: does it make it scarier, or does it cross into sensory overload? There is something to be said for the elegance of a well timed scare, because the tension builds, your mind anticipates, and when the payoff arrives, it hits like a lightning bolt. AI has the potential to upend that rhythm. With constant monitoring and adaptation, there's a risk that the experience could become chaotic, a relentless barrage of shocks that never gives your brain a chance to process what just happened. I mean, imagine stepping into a haunted house where every corner, every sound, every flicker of light is specifically engineered to exploit your fears in real time. Instead of being thrilling, it could just be exhausting. And I'll admit it, I'm fascinated by the concept, because horror, when it's at its best, is very immersive, about getting lost in a story, in an atmosphere, and in the tension. But you got to think about those practical considerations, because it's not a cheap upgrade. These systems are going to be very expensive. It's going to make accessing that horror so much more expensive. So it's, I don't know. Would you step inside? Would you let a haunted maze watch, listen, and respond to every move you make? Me, I'd probably need a moment at the entrance, maybe a stiff drink and a deep breath, because AI could be the most terrifying monster we've seen yet. All right. So I want to talk about this new thing, House on Eden, and this kind of found footage resurgence. So if you scroll through your feed, you've probably seen House on Eden flowing around. It's indie, it's raw. It's part of what I call the found footage revival. Um I Yeah, it could get really dark. I don't know if I could do it either. It would take something extra because AI is like we all have seen Terminator 2. AI is not our friend necessarily. So I want to talk about what House on Eden. It's this revival found footage, but the footage comes not from handheld cameras in the woods like Blair Witch, but it's from smartphones, live streams, and influencer content. I think it's scary because we're now more plugged in than ever, right? So let's dig into what House on Eden is doing differently and why I think people are freaking out and where this new found footage horror can cross the line between innovative and gimmicky. Um, so let's start by setting the stage. House on Eden follows a group of influencers, content creators, streamers, vloggers. They're invited to this mysterious estate known as Eden House. The invite promises exclusive viral content, the perfect setting, unusual artifacts, architectural oddities, hidden rooms, maybe even something supernatural. But the catch is you have to stream or document everything. No off camera moments. Darkness, glitches, shadows, all captured live in real time. So the audience, both the fictional one of the story and us, the real audience, is always watching. That premise really feels like it's ripped from modern concerns. What happens when everything is content? When curation becomes documentation and when privacy is surrendered for clout? House on Eden stakes its horror claim in those questions. Now, we all know found footage isn't new. We've got Blair Witch, Paranormal Activity, Record, Cloverfield, Afflicted, Unfriended, everything. These have all set that template. Limitations on perspective, shaky cam, unseen horrors, uh, just the suggestion over the explicit. The fear often coming from not knowing what's there, hearing something in the static, seeing something for a second and then looking away. And that works because it feels like these things could be real. Now, House on Eden adds an extra layer, the influencer live stream social media element. It's not just camera on tripod, let's record. It's camera, phone, live comments, audience reactions, notification sounds, battery fading, signal cutting out, stream lag. The horror is amplified because it's all things that we can relate to. We've all stood in front of a webcam at this point, it seems, trying to get that perfect shot, worried about how we look, worried about what people might think. We know how easy it is to slip. Social media turns the found footage trope inside out because performance becomes safety net or liability. The influencers want content, they want clicks, likes, followers. The desire can force them into dangerous situations. Maybe they stay longer in Eden when they should run. Maybe they take risks to prove there's something there. The performance becomes not just part of the story, but part of that horror engine. So, what elements are making this resonate? Why is House on Eden scary? And I think there's an authenticity, the moments that feel real, the camera glitches, the unintended audio overlap, the live chat reacting in real time. When those moments are pulled off convincingly, your heart jumps. You believe briefly that you're watching something unscripted. And then there's vulnerability because the influencers are portrayed as flawed. Pride, fear of embarrassment, anxiety about engagement. People who are used to being in control suddenly aren't. And horror loves the idea of control lost. Once the camera goes off or the live stream cuts, the stakes go up. And then there's technology as a double edged sword, phones, streaming, Wi Fi dead zones, all these tech tools that we trust. House on Eden uses all of them against the characters. That's what makes it feel current, not supernatural just for shock, but technological betrayal. And then there's those social feedback loops. Think about the audience in the story demanding more, pushing the characters to escalate, to stay in the dark, to push boundaries. And that echoes what real influencers face: go darker, go viral, scare us more. I think that pressure becomes the fuel of dread. So, Warehouse on Eden risks becoming gimmick. So, I'll be honest, it's the style is a tightrope. For every moment of tension, there's a chance it becomes a spectacle. What happens if everything is too polished? If the found footage feels framed, staged, overly lit, or edited so cleanly that there's no rough edges, you lose believability. The illusion shatters, and the believability is what is the currency here. The social media aspect becomes forced. If characters are constantly stopping horror to announce they're going live, or hold on, got to get the phone angle, it starts to feel like a performance, not survival. And when that stops being character driven and starts being put this in for meme potential, it risks dragging us out of the moment. And then it could get into the overuse of jump scares and predictable tropes, because often in trying to mix found footage with live stream tropes, creators then lean heavily on sudden glitches, ghost faces popping up, static bursts. While these work once or twice, if they're used too much, they become expected. And if we can predict a scare, it's a lot less scary. And ignoring world building and internal logic. If Eden House suddenly breaks its own rules, like how could there be Wi Fi dead zones and perfect signal for dramatic streaming? If shadows act inconsistently, if the rules of what can and can't happen change mid story, that irritates us as an audience, right? So let's talk about some touchstones. For contrast, so we can see where House on Eden is innovating and where it might lean on familiar territory. Because what works? The Blair Witch Project, because it felt like these people just disappeared. Grainy, vague, unhinged. It left everything unsaid, and that's its power. Paranormal Activity, minimalism, tension built over long periods, camera fixed, the uncanny in the everyday. More recently, the movies weren't great, but Unfriended and Host, the idea of using laptops and video calls as framing devices, the lives we lead online becoming battlegrounds for horror, and maybe one of my favorites, Creep and Creep 2, being character driven, disquieting, low budget, high impact horror, and always putting us as the viewer in this uncomfortable proximity to the monster. And then remembering what doesn't work, what flops, too much polish. When indie horror looks like it had a high budget, it loses that scrappy, twitchy realism. And when the found footage is just window dressing, same scares, jump scare tropes, nothing new. And when this influencer culture is only there as a superficial hook. Hey, this is a TikTok influencer, but their behavior doesn't connect with the medium. If their content doesn't feel like actual social media, it'll ring hollow. So, House on Eden, will it be gimmicky? Is it gimmicky, or is it genuinely scary? Yeah. But what does it need to do to pull it off? Limit that polished veneer, make your characters credible, Use the audience inside the narrative, not just as background noise. Follow the rules you make up. If you break the rules, break them should cost something emotionally, visually, or logically. Underplay rather than overplay. Things should be used in suggestion, shadows, things heard, not seen. Let us use our imagination and make it about more than just jumps. Social commentary matters. So I'm pretty excited about House on Eden because I think it signals something new for indie horror. One part supernatural or psychological dread, one part modern anxiety about self representation, digital identity, privacy, performance. It's a horror story for our moment, not just a haunted house in the woods. So, what I'll be watching closely for, and when I see it, or as you do, how the progression of dread builds. Does the film lean too early into spectacle, or does it let tension simmer? How live moments are handled. Are they interludes or core to the plot? If there is meta commentary, do we see the characters questioning whether their own content is harming them? Do they regret going live? And then how the film closes and the message it leaves. Does it say anything about the cost of being seen, or is it just blissfully unaware? So, House on Eden may not reinvent found footage, but it could give it a new spine. That viral culture, live streaming, um, performance anxiety that could push us to a really scary place, something we haven't been in a while. And if it does it right, it won't just make us jump, it'll make us squirm in front of our phones, double checking to see who's actually watching. Uh, so let's start. So we're getting a little long. I was going to talk about homage versus repetition and fan fatigue about a lot of these new legacy sequels we've been getting, but I'll save that hopefully next week with when Mika is able to make it back with us. But so right here, I'll stop. I'll wrap up this week's Wednesday Night Frights. We talked about things from the Conjuring's Final Curtain and Netflix's ever expanding haunted catalog, the AI scare zones of tomorrow. It's really clear to me that the horror genre isn't slowing down. It's looking for new places to expand and grow, and it seems to be evolving faster and faster. There's always something new just lurking right around the corner. So if you enjoyed tonight's solo run, or you just miss Mika, make sure to subscribe on YouTube at Real Talk so you never miss an episode. While you're there, drop your favorite October watch in the comments. Share a story about the scariest thing that's ever happened to you, or just let me know which haunt you'd be brave enough to try or not. And if you're listening on your favorite podcast app, remember, Wednesday Night Frights is available the next day wherever you get your podcast, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, all of those. Hopefully, Mika's back next week bringing her insights, scares, and signature humor. But until then, keep your lights dim, your doors locked, your popcorn close, maybe even check under the bed once or twice, just in case. And don't forget, you can always follow me on Instagram, Threads, TikTok, all at Real Talk, where I try to post updates, behind the scenes, reviews, some horror trivia, different things that make you question why you're still awake tonight. And if you're feeling extra festive, join us on all those pages just for the hell of it. Share your theories, scream about spoilers, or just geek out over the latest films. I'm Josh, and I've been your guide through the darkness, and this has been Wednesday Night Frights. Stay spooky, stay curious, and as always, watch carefully, because you never know what's lurking in the shadows. Thank you, everybody.